Traveling to America. When I landed in New York City in the spring of 2025, the first thing that struck me was the sky, how impossibly blue it looked, despite the concrete jungle clawing at it from every angle. I'd seen the city 1,000 times in films and nothing prepared me for the sensory overload of actually being there. The air buzzed with impatience and ambition. Horns honked with purpose. People didn't just walk, they charged forward like the sidewalks were conveyor belts set at maximum speed. I remember standing at a street corner near Times Square with my luggage, just staring up at the buildings, blinking like I'd stepped onto an... I'd been dreaming of this trip to America for years. Ever since I was a teenager, poring over travel blogs and National Geographic spreads, the country had loomed large in my imagination, a land of contradictions, vastness, and relentless reinvention. I wanted to see the iconic landmarks, sure, but more than that, I wanted to get lost in it, to feel the pulse of different cities, towns, and deserts, and understand what made this place tick. I had 3 months, a backpack, a slightly battered journal, and a prepaid SIM card that I connected just enough to survive without being tethered. My plan, if it could even be called that, was loose. Land in New York, make my way down the East Coast, cut through the South, explore the Southwest deserts, and end up somewhere in California. I didn't book everything in advance. I wanted to leave room for spontaneity, for the unexpected trip memorable. I had my list of must-sees: Statue of Liberty, Grand Canyon, Route 66, Golden Gate Bridge. But beyond that, I was open. New York was everything at once. Loud, vibrant, overwhelming. I stayed in a tiny hostel dorm in the Lower East Side, where the beds creaked and the shared bathroom smelled vaguely of mildew. But none of that mattered. I spent my days walking, no, marching through the city, bagels and endless curiosity. I joined the tourists in Central Park, craned my neck on Fifth Avenue, visited the Met, and got lost in paintings I'd only seen in books. One rainy afternoon, I ducked into a jazz bar in Harlem and sat alone sipping an overpriced cocktail while a trio played something soulful that made the whole electricity. That night, walking back to the hostel in the drizzle, I felt like a character in a novel. I made friends quickly. Americans, I found, were often more friendly than I expected, especially when they learned I was traveling solo. In Brooklyn, I was invited to a rooftop barbecue where I drank a local IPA and listened to people argue passionately about sports teams I bet. One guy, a photographer named Eli, gave me a list of places I absolutely had to see in the South. Another woman, Sophie, told me to avoid Atlanta in July unless I liked walking into a wall of humidity that slaps you every time you step out. From New York, I took a Greyhound bus to Philadelphia. It was a 4-hour ride through landscapes that changed from concrete to leafy suburbs to industrial zones peppered with graffitied factories. Philly was a different rhythm altogether, grittier, perhaps, but with a lot. I tried the legendary cheesesteak at a place that had been there since the 1930s and visited Independence Hall, where the birth of the nation was etched into dusty bricks and echoing chambers. I walked along cobblestone streets and imagined what it must have felt like to live here 2 centuries. Then I hopped a train to Washington, D.C., where monuments loomed like gods over the National Mall, and everything felt imbued with history and significance. D.C. was quieter than I expected. The government buildings were austere and elegant, but what I loved most was the Smithsonian Free Museums filled with treasures. I spent nearly a whole day in the Air and Space Museum, marveling at spacecraft and... One evening, I wandered into a protest in front of the White House. It was peaceful but passionate, and I stood among the crowd feeling like I'd stumbled into a living moment of democracy. A man next to me, holding a sign and wearing a fedora, nodded at me and said, "Welcome to America. We make noise." After DC, I headed south, hopping from city to city: Richmond, Raleigh, Charleston. The accents changed, the food got spicier, and the air thicker. In Savannah, Georgia, I stayed in an old inn with creaking wooden floors and moss-draped oaks outside. It was the kind of place where the past didn't just linger, it lived. I took long walks through its manicured squares and graveyards, reading the epitaphs of people who'd lived and died before airplanes, internet, or smartphones. It was beautiful in a haunted sort. By the time I reached New Orleans, I was already sunburned and freckled, my shoes worn out, my journal nearly full. But nothing could have prepared me for New Orleans. The city pulsed with music live bands on every corner, from brass bands to blues to something that sounded like jazz and gospel. The French Quarter was a kaleidoscope of color and sound, and smell beignets frying in sugar, spiced crawfish steaming in pots, the occasional whiff of something less savory wafting from the gutters. I fell in love with the chaos. I danced in the streets during a second-line parade and ended up with strangers who felt like old friends by the time the sun came up. The morning after that long night in New Orleans, I sat on the steps of my hostel, a mug of lukewarm coffee in hand, watching the city slowly stretch awake. The street sweepers passed like ghosts, erasing the evidence of the night before: beads tangled in fences, glitter on the sidewalks, forgotten cups. I felt like I'd stumbled upon some secret, some alchemy where music and memory and heat combined into something wholly unique. I didn't want to leave, but the road was calling, and I had a long way to go. From New Orleans, I rented a beat-up sedan, cheap, reliable, nothing flashy, and started heading west. The first few days on the road were strange and freeing. I took the back roads through Louisiana and into Texas, where the flatland seemed to stretch forever under a vault of open sky. I drove with the windows down, dust swirling through the air, country music crackling from a station I could barely pick up. In some small town, whose name I forgot the moment I passed it, I stopped at a diner for lunch. The waitress, who looked like she'd been working there since the Reagan era, gave me a glass of sweet tea the size of my head and told me I had a gentle kind of accent. I smiled and told her I wasn't from around here. "You don't have to tell me. You've got wanderer written all over you." Texas was a country unto itself. I spent a few days in Austin, drawn in by the promise of live music and food trucks. It delivered. I saw a band playing in a converted garage, their instruments duct-taped and worn, their sound honest and raw. I ate tacos and laughed with locals who were thrilled to share their city with a traveler like me. Then I drove west, through the hill country and into the desert, where the land became more myth than geography. In Marfa, I stayed in a trailer park turned artist retreat, where people spoke in slow, philosophical sentences and watched for mysterious lights on the horizon at night. But I felt something out there, something vast and humbling. I crossed into New Mexico as the sky turned copper and blood orange, the kind of sunset that made you believe in God, or at least in the poetry of the universe. Santa Fe was adobe and art galleries, dry air and turquoise. I wandered the market stalls and bought a hand-woven bracelet from a Navajo artist who told me it was made with storm patterns for protection on journeys. "You're on one hell of a journey," he said, eyes knowing. I nodded because I was starting to feel it, not just the miles, but the changes unfolding inside me. In Albuquerque, I took a tram up the Saundia Mountains and stood on the edge of the world, wind whipping at my jacket, staring down at the sprawling city below. There was a quiet in the desert that I hadn't felt in the cities, a stillness that made me. I began to understand why people came out here to find themselves or to lose the things they no longer needed. I scribbled furiously in my journal that night, trying to catch the fleeting thoughts before they slipped into the ether. By the time I reached Arizona, my skin was brown from the sun, and my soul felt lighter somehow. I camped in the petrified forest, hiked through canyons that looked like something out of a dream, and finally made it to the Grand. I stood at the rim at sunrise, watching the shadows shift and spill like ink across the cliffs. I didn't take a photo. I didn't even speak. I just stood there, hands in my pockets, heart in my throat, letting it all in. That moment was. I continued west along parts of Route 66, stopping in kitschy roadside attractions, giant fiberglass dinosaurs, neon-lit motels, forgotten towns where time moved at half speed. I felt like I was driving through the ghosts of America, past echoes of a different. I stayed in a motel in Kingman with faded curtains and a rickety AC unit, and ate a burger in a place where the waitress called everyone sweetheart, and the jukebox hadn't changed its playlist in 20 years. California welcomed me with palm trees and promise. My first stop was Joshua Tree, where I parked the car and wandered into the alien landscape of twisted trees and hulking rocks. I watched the stars emerge one by one, more than I'd ever seen in my life. I met a group of travelers sitting around trading stories, sipping whiskey out of tin cups. One of them, a bearded poet from Oregon, recited something he wrote about broken hearts and desert winds, and I felt it in my chest like a punch. Los Angeles was a different kind of dream. I stayed in Venice Beach, walking the boardwalk every morning, sipping smoothies and watching skateboarders defy gravity. I saw the Hollywood sign through a haze of smog and stood in front of the Chinese theater, trying to match my feet with the. LA was both glamorous and gritty, polished and peeling. I got lost in Griffith Park, visited museums, and one night found myself at a warehouse rave downtown, dancing to pulsing beats with people who spoke in half smiles and midnight for. Then it was north along the Pacific Coast Highway, easily one of the most beautiful drives of my life. Cliffs and waves, redwoods and rolling fog. I stopped whenever I felt like it, to watch sea lions bark on the rocks, to breathe in the eucalyptus, to snap a mental picture of a winding road disappearing. In Big Sur, I stayed in a cabin with no Wi-Fi, just the sound of the ocean crashing below. I wrote letters I never sent. I cooked over a fire. I remembered how to be. San Francisco rose like a dream out of the fog. The Golden Gate Bridge was as majestic as I'd imagined, and I crossed it on foot with my heart wide open. The city was hilly, colorful, stubbornly unique. I rode the cable cars, visited Alcatraz, and ate clam chowder from a bread bowl. But what I loved most was just wandering through the Mission, through Haight-Ashbury, through quiet neighborhoods where murals told stories more eloquent than most novels. It was there, in San Francisco, sitting in a tiny cafe on a rainy afternoon, that I realized my journey was coming to an end. My visa was nearly up. My bank account was definitely suffering. But more than that, I could feel it in my bones. The sense that this chapter was closing, that the road had taken me where I thought back to all the places I'd been. The blinding lights of Times Square, the hush of DC monuments, the soulful chaos of New Orleans, the stillness of the desert, the roar of the Pacific. I thought of all the people I'd met, generous, wild, curious. Strangers who had fed me, guided me, danced with me, laughed with me. I thought of who I was when I boarded that plane months ago, full of expectation and nervous excitement, and who I had become now, weathered, awed, maybe a little. Travel doesn't solve everything. It doesn't fix the deep cracks or answer every question. But it changes you. It stretches your perspective, makes the world feel both bigger and more connected. It reminds you that beauty hides in the most unexpected places, on dusty highways, in quiet moments with strangers. When I finally flew out of San Francisco, the plane rising into the clouds, I didn't feel sad. I felt grateful. I had come looking for America, and I had found it, not in the postcards or the tourist brochures, but in the stories layered in its streets, its deserts, its mountains. And maybe, just maybe, I'd found a little more of myself too.